require investment to ensure healthy growth and development and productive economic futures. Caregivers, especially the sandwich generation caught in the middle, need more support to avoid burnout. Fiscal stress underscores the importance of finding new ways to meet these changing needs. Fortunately, responding to these needs can contribute to the creation of dynamic communities that provide supportive and healthy environments for all stages of the life cycle. In this webinar, we'll be talking about three aspects and offering some fresh perspectives on, first, the economics of families. Prevailing wisdom suggests that families with young children are a cost to communities, whereas retiring baby boomers are a form of gray gold. But the reality is that both groups represent important costs and benefits for communities. Understanding these economic realities will help communities plan for all ages. Secondly, service integration. Traditionally, we have provided services in age-segregated silos. The opportunity to integrate service delivery can improve service effectiveness and efficiency. And finally, physical design. To promote more independence among children and elders, we need to design environments which provide housing and transportation alternatives and enable independence, thereby reducing the need for services and promoting healthy lifestyles and development. Our two speakers today are Professors Mildred Warner and Deborah Howe. Mildred Warner is a professor of city and regional planning at Cornell University. She directs the Linking Economic Development and Child Care Project, which has been funded by the Kellogg Foundation and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And she spearheaded work with the American Planning Association on planners' role in creating family-friendly communities. Currently, Professor Warner is directing a project looking at multi-generational planning among rural and urban communities, and this is supported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Deborah Howe is a professor and chair of the Department of Community and Regional Planning at Temple University. She's directed an Administration on Aging grant to raise awareness of the importance of community planning for aging, and has given presentations and published on this topic for a number of years. She recently led a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation study of land use policy innovations that contribute to built environments that support active living. I want to draw your attention to some related events coming up at the APA National Conference in Los Angeles next month. First, Professor Warner will be hosting a focus group on multi-generational planning. This focus group will be following our business meeting for the Planning and Women Division. It will be Sunday, April 15th from 1 to 2 p.m. And the location is a Marriott Hotel, room Georgia 1. Also, there is a session that the Planning and Women Division will be sponsoring that will be very related to the topic today. The title is Creating Child and Age-Friendly Communities. That will be Monday, April 16th from 10:30 to 11:45 a.m. We will be hearing again from Professors Warner and Howe, as well as Professor Kenya Covington from Cal State Northridge and Ramona Mulehi from HUD in Hawaii. I would also like to point out that the topic today and at the conference are related to two initiatives that the divisions in APA have been working on and focusing on. One is aging and livable communities, and the other is planning for more dynamic populations. You can find out more about these division initiatives on the APA website under the topic heading of On the Radar. And at this point, I will be introducing Professor Mildred Warner.
Hi. Am I on now? Okay. What I'd like to talk to you all about today is the economic impact of families, looking at both children, seniors, and caregivers. And what I want to do with my talk is, something's held up here. Okay, sorry, we had a little technical difficulty. Okay, what I want to talk about, Libby had just talked about the sandwich generation and the fact that we all have care needs and care responsibilities throughout the life cycle. So when we're young and when we're old, we need care, and when we're sick. And then sort of in that middle period of life, we are the primary caregivers. And in the U.S. society, we typically tend to think of these care burdens as the private responsibility of families, and yet the reality is that these problems are in many ways structural. They're born by demographics, and they can be addressed if we design our communities in ways that are more supportive of both children and elders to help them maintain their independence, and also more supportive of the caregivers themselves. If we think about how we plan and design transportation systems, housing, recreation systems to support both those who need care and those who are giving it. And the purpose of this lecture today, discussion today, is to talk about what's planners' role. But I want to start with giving some context. We can think about the fact that when you are in need of care, it's costly, and the cost is not just borne privately, but it's also borne in part by public funding sources. And this picture you have in front of you comes from a report by Julia Isaacs at the Urban Institute, which looks at federal, state, and local spending on elders and children. And what you'll notice is that the circle of public spending on the elderly is 3 times larger than the circle that captures public spending per child. Not only do we spend more on elders, that spending is primarily borne at the federal level, whereas spending for children is a burden that's primarily borne at the local level. If we break this down further and look at it by age, Ryan Edwards has done this using 2004 data, and what we see is that the red line, which is state and local expenditures, begin to rise after age 5 with public schooling. Then they drop after age 18, but many communities support community colleges and job training programs. And then they don't begin rising again until about age 75, and this is when elders age and begin to need more community support services. You'll notice that the federal, the blue line, is pretty flat up until about age 55, and then it starts to rise. And again, this is capturing primarily Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security payments. What I want to draw your attention to is the underinvestment by both federal and state and local public governments on the 0 to 5 group. Little children and their care is really considered the private responsibility of families in our society, and the underinvestment in care supports for young children and their parents is one of the themes that I want to give special emphasis to in my part of today's webinar. At the other end of the graph, you see I have some arrows pointing from the red line pointing back in and the blue line pointing out, and the idea here is that the current debates in Congress suggest that there's real pressures to reform, that is, reduce federal support for elderly, and what this will do is increase the expectations and requirements that local governments face. Because the fact of the matter is that people live in cities, and the cities where they live have to respond to their needs. You know, whatever the legislation says, the needs are in your community and you must respond. So that takes us to this issue of the city. And it's actually a rather difficult context for family-friendly planning. Cities are expected to increase their tax base, and there's recognition that families, particularly families with young children, cost more to serve and may not contribute as much to the local tax base. Similarly with elders, property tax circuit breakers for senior citizens also reduce the amount of tax revenue received. The pressure for economic development has really been focused on young professionals and empty nesters, this creative class, and cities have rebuilt themselves, particularly their downtowns, to attract these childless families. And with devolution, cities are burdened with more social responsibilities, but yet they still feel this need to focus on economic productivity. And as I said before, family care in the U.S. is considered private. It's often unseen in economic planning, and I think that's the part that really needs to change. So there's positive openings in this economic development logic. Even though we're in a recession right now, we will be seeing labor scarcity, especially for low-wage jobs in the care sector, in the child care sector and in the home health care sector. And many of these jobs are staffed by young parents who have young children. And because of the spatial mismatch with where lower-income workers live and where the needs are, you end up with a lot of long commutes to work. This is something that planners can address. This emphasis on creative class has begun to shift toward an emphasis on creative society and the notion that for communities to be vibrant, they need to retain families. As young adults marry or have children, you don't want to lose them to other communities. You want to keep them in your own community. And there's also a recognition that very young children are actually an economic development investment as well, and that we need to pay attention to what the brain research shows us about the important benefits of high-quality early childhood experiences in giving us returns to preschool and better school performance as children go forward. So what this suggests is that we need a comprehensive approach. Now, what I'm going to do in the next few slides is try to debunk the myth that families with young children cost too much and we should zone them out of our communities. I want to turn that logic around and begin to think about the economic importance of families with young children. And what you see in this current chart, it's consumer expenditure survey data that shows average annual income and average annual expenses by age group. And what you'll notice is that people in the 35 to 64 age group, which is the age group where you mostly find families with children still at home, earn the highest incomes and spend the most. And this is important for local economic development. Let's look at what they spend their money on. Now, the total spending on children on average, the average spending that the typical family makes per child is over $200,000 over the course of birth to age 17. What do they spend it on? 77% of those expenditures are on local services. Housing is at 31, child care is at 17, food at 16, transportation at 13. These are the critical services important for children. And frankly, they're important for all of us, and they're the critical services that make our economies function and that make them good places to live. There's been a lot of work around the country on regional economic impact analysis, where people have come up with multipliers. So what does a new dollar spent in child care generate in the broader economy? What does a new job in child care generate in the broader economy? And what you'll see in these multiplier comparisons, which are based on analysis we did of all 50 states, so these are state-level multipliers, you'll see that for every new dollar spent on child care, there's an extra 91 cents generated in the economy beyond that first dollar. And for every new job created in child care, there's an extra half job generated in the rest of the economy through the multiplier effect. When we compare these child care multipliers to other infrastructure sectors like colleges or local passenger transit, or quality of life sectors like eating and drinking or amusement services, or traded sectors like wholesale, retail, tourism, and manufacturing, you'll see that child care compares favorably or actually slightly better on its multipliers than these other sectors. Traditionally, economists have ignored local services, saying they don't count. But what we're recognizing now that we're in a world that's primarily a service economy is that local services actually count for a lot in terms of employment, economic well-being, and quality of life in the local community. And services for children are especially important among local service sectors. Laura Reese has done some interesting work looking beyond the attention to the creative class to attention on families with children. And she's done analysis of 300 cities and compared their economic growth and asked what leads to it. Are they the creative economy variables that have been so popularized by Richard Florida's work, which talks about the importance of college-educated, ethnic diversity, and foreign-born? And you'll see the correlations here in this picture. They're important. But then she also looks at families with children and shows that cities that have more families with children have higher economic growth, and cities that attract people in the 30 to 34 age range, which is when you're typically starting that family formation, also have higher economic growth. And then she looks at other public investment possibilities in infrastructure, school construction, high school graduation rates, parks and rec, and also these are things that are positively associated with economic growth. Okay, in the first part of the talk, I wanted to turn the idea around and suggest that families with young children are actually positive contributors to economic growth. And I think these past slides have shown that. Now the challenge is to figure out what can planners do. Now there's a number of things that planners can do. We can focus on transportation that's not just about journey to work, but journey to childcare and then work and then back to childcare and to the grocery store and home, and we can think about that trip chaining in our transportation plans. We can link childcare to economic development and promote business development support and economic development loans for childcare because it's a sector that has a lot of market challenges and needs economic development support. Cities can focus on providing recreational services for children and for elders. Safe routes to schools are common in many communities. The need for walkable streets is something that we're giving more attention to now. Affordable housing is critical for young families and for elders because at these times in the life cycle are when you have less income and less money to spend. It's also important to involve families in planning debate. You're beginning to see more attention to youth planning efforts and efforts that include elders. And as Libby mentioned in the introduction, there appears to be the possibility to begin to integrate services for children and elders rather than have these services segregated into silos of programs for children as being separate programs for elders. There are more possibilities for service integration than we've attempted in the past. And finally, and Deborah Howe will talk a lot about this in the next part of our webinar, we need to give more attention to universal design, physical design that's accessible for all people, not just folks in the middle, but little kids, elders, disabled, everyone. Now, there's rising interest across the U.S. in this issue. In 2005, the AARP did a survey of people over age 50 and found that the majority of baby boomers want to age in place. Now, when you think about what kinds of community design features you need to age in place, they're very similar to the things that young children need for healthy development. Walkable streets, transit, because seniors who have given up their cars or their licenses and children who aren't yet old enough to drive are both transit-dependent populations. They need nearby services that are walkable. They need affordable housing. They need recreation spaces that are appropriate to their developmental stage. And they need opportunities for civic engagement. Around the country over the last 15 years, coalitions of child care leaders, businesses, typically led by their chambers of commerce, and economic development leaders have been coming together to do regional economic impact studies of the child care sector, recognizing that child care is an infrastructure in which we have underinvested. Most communities in the U.S. face an inadequate supply of affordable quality child care. And so these coalitions have come together to say, what can we do to strengthen this critical infrastructure in our communities? In 2008, we worked with the American Planning Association to conduct a survey on planners' role in creating more family-friendly cities. And on this survey, we measured attitudes toward families with young children, barriers, and opportunities to make positive action on the ground. And what I want to show you in the next few slides is a few of those survey results. And on the slide we're looking at right now, you see a series of attitude statements and the overwhelming positive support that responding planners gave to these to these attitude statements. And the question was, do you agree, disagree, various ranges of disagree, and do you agree? And the 97% here is those who agreed that, yes, families are important to community sustainability. They're a valuable consumer population. This reflects some of the slides I showed you earlier. They also agreed that communities are more vibrant if they have people of all ages, so you retain people across the entire life cycle. They noted that families with young children have higher civic engagement, and they also recognized that families' needs are quite similar to those of the elderly. On this next slide, I'm giving you the results from the survey that addressed challenges. What are the barriers that currently exist in your community that prevent it from being family-friendly? And lack of affordable housing is the top one, with 66% of the almost 1,000 planners who responded to the survey saying this was an issue. Exclusionary zoning and single-use zoning was noted by slightly less than half. Insensitive urban design. Property taxes being too high, and this gets back to the finance question. Lack of services, parking requirements, lack of quality education, and interestingly, crime was not listed as a barrier that prevents communities from being family-friendly. We also found barriers that we related to ignorance, lack of understanding of the issue, and active resistance. So let's look at this next table, and you'll see that complexity of issue, unaware of what is required. This we capture more as ignorance, not knowing what to do, as compared to the ones at the bottom, NIMBYism, lack of voices for families, insufficient political interest, lack of community interest, as being some of these are more active resistance barriers, resistance to change, resistance to addressing the issues that you need to address if you're going to make your cities more friendly to families with young children. So planners can do a lot to advance family interest. In transportation, we can move beyond a focus on the car and think about trip chaining, as I mentioned before. On housing, we can look at accessory flats. We can also look at zoning that allows child care by right in housing developments. With respect to child care, most planners do not realize there's an inadequate supply of quality, affordable child care in their communities. And this is interesting because when we've done surveys of economic developers, the majority of them do recognize the problem of inadequate child care supply. Family participation is important, particularly if you involve families and youth in helping to think about planning and design. You'll get more comprehensive approaches. And as I mentioned before, economic development and planning tools can be applied to care services to help promote their economic viability and to expand the quality and the affordability of those services in your community. We took the results of the APA survey and we did some regression analysis on it, and we found that communities that engage families and youth participation in their planning process do more actions to support families. Similarly, communities that brand themselves as family-friendly do more actions, as do those that include family issues in their site planning and zoning rules. Interestingly, we found the mid-sized cities had less action than either the smaller ones or the larger ones, which again might suggest the challenges that suburbs are facing in retrofitting themselves and redesigning themselves to meet the needs of transit-dependent populations. We also discovered that communities that had more action on the ground faced more resistance. But we wondered if you could reduce that resistance in any way, and we discovered that positive attitudes help to reduce resistance. Now, how do you get positive attitudes? That partly involves an education process and involving people in the planning process. But it turns out that in the comprehensive plan, if you actually put in your plan goals that talk about supporting families with young children, that's actually where some of the resistance will come up. In this broad articulation of community goals is where you will see resistance make itself felt, and it's partly based on ignorance of how to move. But once you get to the specifics of site planning and zoning, those aren't related to resistance. So it's sort of this broad articulation of the vision as distinct from the more specific nitty-gritty of what you do on daily planning and zoning rules. So that's where you really get the action, but the comprehensive planning, it's important to work on these common visions, but that's also where you get the resistance. So that's something to think about. In fact, you all could tell me whether or not this has been your experience in your own communities, but this is what showed up in the survey that we did with APA in 2008. So what I want to turn my attention now is this new project that we're working on here that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has funded us to look at, and to look at the promise of multi-generational planning, because one of their concerns is, particularly for smaller and rural communities that have been retirement destination communities, they're going to face increasing demands from elders as they age and become in more need of services, and that many of the things they need are things that are also needed by young children. And the idea here is that if we could craft a common vision, and the AARP surveys show us that the needs are pretty similar between children and elders, we could begin to think about how we might share and integrate services, and how we might promote more universal design that encourages people to be independent over a longer period of their life cycle. And this takes us to the new approaches to planning that we want to talk about for the rest of this webinar today. So on the common vision issue, we have ethnic, income, and cultural diversity across the generations. And in the next slide I'm going to show you, you'll see how important this is. And despite this diversity, I'm arguing that there are common needs and common interests across these groups. With respect to physical planning, I think there's tremendous room for universal design, both in terms of our streetscapes, in terms of walkability and complete streets, but also in terms of how we think about development, and particularly mixed-use development. We can also certainly use universal design principles in housing, when we think about housing that you could stay in throughout the life cycle, or accessory flats that will help to increase density in suburban areas and place elders near younger families who can provide informal care supports. Finally, with respect to shared services, it's possible to use transportation and daycare settings that can support both child and elder care. We can think about our parks and recreation departments as providing services not just for youth, but also for the elders. And then there's a lot of opportunity for school and community collaborations. It's actually pretty exciting. But the point I want you to remember here is that environmental design can enhance the independence of both children and elders. Environments enable and they disable. If the door weighs 1,000 pounds, none of us can open it. If the handle is too high, a child can't reach it. There are things that are relatively easy to change that can enhance the independence of populations that have traditionally been made dependent by poor environmental design. I was talking about the challenge of building coalitions across the generations, and this graphic put together by PolicyLink out in California I think shows this quite well. This is the U.S. population by age, race, and ethnicity, and what you'll notice is that today's children are more heavily minority than today's elders. And this difference in race and ethnicity, which also is reflected in a difference of income, I think is part of what makes it difficult for us to build a conversation across this whole lifespan, and particularly talk about the commonality of interests and needs on the part of seniors and children. But I think if we could do so, it could really help us move forward the conversation about multi-generational planning. I had mentioned the possibility of integrating services, and here are some examples from California and San Jose and Fruitvale near Oakland, where they integrated housing, child care with light rail stops. And so what you see here is new development near transit. So you have a transit-oriented development that has child care right next to the transit stop and housing right next to that. So you get some You get to mix funding streams. You get to be in a place that's already convenient for people in terms of arriving with their children because they're heading to the transit station anyway. And it's an opportunity to reduce the stress and the burden on families and actually to more integrate housing, transportation, and care services. The opportunities for service integration are ones I'm particularly excited about, and there's been the beginning of more interest on joint use agreements and shared services across agencies, across ages, and between cities and schools. And planners are a group that I think could give a lot more attention to thinking about the possibilities of collaborations with schools, because schools are often the only public institution located in a neighborhood, and they could become more full-service institutions for those across the life cycle. The motivators to do this are the notion of improved access with a neighborhood-based institution, the opportunity to improve service quality, to share cost, and schools are under very deep financial pressures. There's also some economies of scale. And there's the fact of underutilized facilities. If you have buildings that are left closed, 8, 10 hours a day, particularly in the evenings and weekends when the broader set of residents of the community are in the neighborhood. Often at that time, schools and their facilities are closed. The barriers to such coordination are the challenges of coordination, thinking about the different priorities of schools versus communities, the staffing issues, the budgeting issues, particularly regarding maintenance and the janitor that will have to stay there to keep the school open. There's concerns with risk management and liability, but these can all be addressed. What you need is a structure for collaborative planning. And I'd like to highlight Charlotte, North Carolina, because they've created such a structure. They have a committee that looks at infrastructure development of all types, be it transportation, schooling, anything with the city, and they coordinate across all departments. And here's an example with Sterling Elementary School and Charlotte Area Transit. Sterling Elementary was a new school built out in a more outlying community, and the transit wanted to extend a light rail stop and place it near the school, but there was a challenge with where to have enough room for the parking lot and the need for a children's playground. So by combining funding, they actually built a parking garage, and this playground that you're looking at is the roof of the parking garage. So the cars are underneath in 3 levels, and the children are on a flat level direct with the school for their playground. And this area is built near it's on a steep slope. So what you've done is you've evened up the land area for the school, and you've taken advantage of that slope to put in your parking garage. And you have this very convenient location for parents, particularly as they're dropping kids to school and then heading on into work. On my last slide here, I'm mentioning some of the resources that we have for you. The Cornell Project has just produced a new issue brief on the economic importance of families with children, and this is available on our website, Economic Development and Child Care, and it's also available on the webinar website today. So if you want to click on that or either of our 2 presentations, they're both available. I also wanted to make you aware of InPlan, the National Policy and Legal Analysis Network, which has worked on the liability issues for school and community collaborations. And then finally, I wanted to highlight the Center for Cities and Schools, which is based out of Berkeley and has done a lot of interesting work on these joint use agreements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Howe.
Okay. Thanks, Mildred. I really welcome the opportunity to talk with everybody today. I have been working on this topic for nearly 25 years when I first secured an Administration on Aging grant in the late 80s to test and train materials directed to planners and local policymakers about what we should be doing at the community level to plan for an aging society. The urgency for me personally has become even greater as I'm dealing with 4 elderly parents, in-laws and parents that are raised in the age between 85 and 96. And so the urgency is more significant at a personal level. I really feel deeply that there is much that we need to be taking on as a professional community to address the needs of an aging society. So I will be making the case as to why this is important, and then giving a range of examples as to what we can do to respond to these needs. Aging is a process that begins the moment we are born. It involves growth, development, and change. Aging enables us to do wonderful things in our lives, to raise families, to see the world, to lead productive lives, and to stretch our limits in multitudinous ways. But our abilities change over time. In short, we begin to wear out. No surprise here. We just think of all we ask our bodies to do through the years. But it's important to understand these dimensions of the changes that we may face. We don't know exactly what we are going to individually experience, but these things that are listed here are pretty typical. And I should note that when I was involved in developing a planning advisory service report for the APA, initially the editors didn't want me to include a section on these changes because they thought it was too depressing. And I pointed out that this is the reason why we need to pay attention to changes in our environment. So, strength, agility, and fine motor control and decline in bone density can contribute to problems with balance and an increased risk of injuries from falls. In terms of vision, the lens of the eye becomes harder, less flexible, more yellow, and more opaque, contributing to myriad problems, including difficulty in depth perception, increased sensitivity to glare, and inability to focus on near objects such as written material. Hearing, taste, smell, and skin sensitivity create challenges in daily life. Flexibility and reaction time, significant bearing in terms of our capacity to continue driving, and the propensity towards falls. Mental health is an issue, particularly as people suffer significant loss and change in their life and have to cope with declining abilities in terms of their physical and emotional capacities. Dementia affects half of all people aged 85 and older with impairments, including loss of orientation, short and long-term memory, and ability to carry out sequential tasks along with slowed reaction time. My own dad was flying an airplane 6 years ago when he was 82. He's now in a dementia, spent 3 years in a dementia unit, and he can't remember, as I visit with him, he can't remember it past 15 minutes. So you very much learn to enjoy the time and live in the here and now when you're working with older people. And it took a long time before he comprehended that he could no longer fly airplanes. While aging is a very personal experience, it has enormous societal implications. Due to greater longevity, the number of older people is increasing dramatically. In 1900, we had 3.1 million, and by 2050, we will have 86.7 million. The fastest growing age group is the oldest of the old. In the cohort that ranges from 85 to 94, that increased in 2000 from 3.9 million to 5.1 million. So we are not only having more older people, we're getting more of the frail elderly. As we change, so does our need for assistance, which increases by age. And so for those who are 85 and above, half of all these people will need daily assistance in their life. Historically, that support has been provided by families, but our family demographics are changing very significantly, and that means that there are fewer family members to care for their elders. So in 1976, for women who were aged 40 to 44, 10% were childless, and they averaged 3.1 children per woman. In contrast, in 2002, it was 18% childless, and averaged 1.9 children per woman. I had a colleague at Portland State University who had a single child, and this young man faces the prospects of providing support not only to his parents, but to uncles and aunts that do not have children. So, it raises questions about what's going to be possible as these people age in terms of level of family support. Costs of care are very significant. Nursing home care averaged in 2010 $205 daily for a semi-private room. Assisted living facilities, $3,300 and above. My dad, who's was in what's called a memory care unit. We're talking about $5,200 to $5,300 a month. He's been there 3 years, and so you can do the math. It's a significant cost, and that's borne privately. The federal government doesn't pay that. Additional issues include the impact of this economic decline that we're all experiencing, and for elders, they don't have the perspective that maybe in 10 years they'll be able to survive this. They are having to deal with the fact that they do not have money for the immediate future that they need. Again, an example from my own family situation. My parents had an investment in a bank that went belly up, and the bank had the stock. It was a bank that my dad had helped start, and it had been worth $300,000, and my mother had to sell the stock for $10,000. Now, she was going to live on that, and that's not going to happen now. And I only say these stories just to mention the large numbers that are incomprehensible. The loss and the impact on retirees right after the initial part of the economic decline in 2008 was calculated as something on the order of $2 trillion. And I can't comprehend that number. But when you personalize it, you begin to realize this is serious business. So the impact of rising fuel costs is significant. And then there's the issue of the crossover point in the housing market, where we have so many older people who are trying to sell their houses, and there's not enough people to buy their houses, and so housing values decline. That's separate from the issue of the 2008 economic decline. The Senior Citizens League estimated average Social Security benefits of $1,000 per month were they lost 51% of their spending power between 2000 and 2008 due to increases in energy, medical, housing, insurance, and other costs. The dilemma that we face is that the market that we've created, the environment that we have created, does not support an aging society. The single-family home is quite dominant throughout the United States, and it has a number of problems relative to the capacity of people to age in place. We have a lot of people, older people, who are living in the suburbs. Half of them are currently in the suburbs. By 2030, it's going to be 8 out of 10. A fourth of them are living in rural areas. 3/4 are in single-family detached homes with 1,700 square feet and more on 30-acre lots. Not quite a third of all seniors live alone. For those 85 and above, 37% of men and 50% of women live alone. And it might be a different scenario if more people lived with their families in terms of being able to provide support. However, people choose and want to live alone, and there are problems in terms of them joining their families and living in multi-generational households. Ownership rates are over 80%. The median duration in the home is 25 years. I should note that any number of times planners have asked why people don't simply move, and there's real challenges in moving. There are oftentimes not places that they can move to, and they also, when the market has gone down, they may not have alternatives. To sell their property, it's not going to be able to sell for very much, and the alternatives that they would buy into are so expensive. So in order to just illustrate how I would go about dimensioning some of the aging issues, I wanted to just share a case study of Upper Dublin, Pennsylvania. This is a suburban community that is where my campus is located. I'm in Temple University Ambler campus, which is about 15 miles northwest of Philadelphia proper. The Upper Dublin is a community of about 25,600 residents, predominantly white, 83%, and they're very high-quality schools. I did a presentation for them on aging and had presented this kind of the background that I had just given you, and then I went into more specifics about Upper Dublin. And this kind of analysis you could do for any community. This is a standard comparison that we as planners do, and that is that we compare the demographics from one era to next. So this one is comparing 1990 to 2000. And so you can see where there's changes in each 5-year age cohort. In this case, what I've done is show the differences, the absolute differences between the 1990 age cohort and the 2000 age cohorts. And when you look at this, you initially have the impression that, oh, there's an increase in the people who are between 70 and 74 and between 75 and 79. So there must be, you know, people that are aging in place, or maybe there's people moving into this community, et cetera. But that's not a correct interpretation. That may be appropriate in terms of providing data that's useful for understanding service needs in this community, but it's not going to tell you about the dynamics of the change that's occurring in this community. Because in 2000, the people who lived there in 1990 will be 10 years older. So you need to age the 1990 data and then compare it to 2000, and you get a somewhat different graphic. So this one shows any change in this cohort, these cohorts, is a result of people in these age groups moving into or out of the community. We can see that families with children are moving into the community. Note the increase in the 10 to 14 age group and the 25 to 49 age group. No, I'm sorry, the 35 to 49 age group. You'll see that the young adults are moving out between 20 and 34, and in fact, older people are moving out. Now, some people may be passing away, but in contrast to the previous graphic where there was an absolute increase in the 70 to 74 and 75 to 79, these people are moving out, because what this graphic reflects is the number of people who were in the age cohort in 1990 plus 10 years. So the reason why the numbers were higher in the previous graphic, this one, was because you had a lot of people aged 60 to 74 and 65 to 69 in 1990, and they're now 10 years older. So this helps identify issues that have a bearing on the extent to which this community can and does support aging. And you look at this and go, immediately you wonder, okay, why are the young people moving out? Well, in all likelihood, it's an issue of housing availability and housing costs. Why are seniors moving out? In all likelihood, it's a problem with housing. I mean, it raises questions that you can then test and follow up with additional information. And I had noted that this is a community that is very strong on the schools, so that's why the families are moving in. But it just pulled out some additional data, and it shows that the owner-occupied units were almost 90%, including single, 3/4 of them are one-unit detached housing. Another 15% are the row houses. Median rent is $890. All of this is information that the community can use in terms of understanding their dynamics. Households they have far more seniors in their households than I think they realize. When I shared this data with them, 1/4 of all households have somebody who's 65 and above. And there also is very strong longevity in this community of people living in their housing units of 20 years or more. So we have this, you know, if anybody can do this with their own community, the community next door, which is an older borough, will have very different dynamics. Let's explore now some of the alternatives that are available in terms of meeting the needs of older people. Issues of access. These pictures are all showing problems with accessibility and getting into a house. The one in the far right, upper right, just shows a small step into a house. But I knew a young man who had muscular dystrophy, and he would not be able to negotiate that step. That's a huge barrier to him. The one on the right, it shows, lower right, shows extensive retrofit to accommodate a person with wheelchair. The one on the left is, you know, typical of some of our older housing stock, although the sad thing is that so much new housing continues to be built with that. That's the kind of steps in mind. It's the expected, it's the norm, and yet it's something that's not necessarily needed in new construction. This woman here, Eleanor Smith, has been the leader in developing the concept of visitability. She is disabled. She uses a wheelchair. And she's the director of Concrete Change based in Atlanta. Her efforts have led to the passage of local ordinances resulting in more than 35,000 visitable homes, which were built deliberately with basic access, even though intended for the open market. In other words, requirements that their new houses were to have 3 particular requirements. They had to have a way of accessing the first floor with 0 steps. And it can be in the front of the house, as in the lower right image, or in the back of the house, as in the upper right image. It can be through a garage door. It could be in an alley, etc. In the Pima County, Arizona, the visitability requirements in 2002 resulted in 15,000 new visitable housing units within 5 years. So it's an example of a change that was pretty simple in concept and yet has had a profound impact. Changes can cost as little as $100 for an on-slab construction or $300 to $600 for a house with a foundation. Retrofitting houses that do not have such accommodations can cost thousands of dollars. Here's an example of the access through the alley and the garages of a house, and also it shows how visitability can be accommodated as well in new row housing. Universal design, which Mildred just mentioned earlier, is a concept in which the design is provided, addresses people of all abilities. I'm interested specifically here in its focus on housing. It can be a significant consideration in design for public buildings and recreational areas, and even applied to a community as a whole. The idea is that people can use this, or that you may have an ability to easily modify something to accommodate somebody with disability later on. So you might, for example, not have a grab bar in initially, but you may have the studs in place within the wall so that you could put in a grab bar later on. It can be quite elegant. Note the handle at the lower left. And it could be something that's planned for the future. So, for example, the closet in the upper right is actually designed to be an elevator shaft should somebody at some point need to have that accommodation. Accessory dwellings, they include separate living units within the main structure of a single-family home, backyard cottages, or apartments above garages. They are subordinate to the main dwelling, thus supporting the overall single-family housing image. The units provide opportunities for additional income for the homeowner, living space for caregivers or family members, more security for those who live alone, and greater flexibility in the use of housing resources. ADUs are viable housing alternatives in all sorts of communities. The images above are in Brattleboro, Vermont. The lower left is Hood River, Oregon. The lower right is in Seattle. I'm a proponent of flexible housing, which is the idea there is that you design a house so that you can create or remove an accessory apartment very easily. And so a young family who might not have an income could have an accessory apartment to help offset their mortgage. As their family grows, they could remove it and use the space, and then they could go back to using the accessory apartment later on. I personally feel that this is something that every municipality should allow, and they should allow it with very little limitations, because there's so many accessory apartment provisions that are just overly restrictive. They might restrict it to elders or to family members. You know, they'll only allow for a family member to live in the apartment, and I just think that really limits the usability of this approach in terms of meeting our needs. I think it's tremendously exciting that we've moved in the direction across the country with mixed-use development. It's creating many exciting forms, including housing above libraries, grocery stores, and other retail uses. Once the purview of revitalizing downtowns, mixed uses can be increasingly found in suburban communities. For older adults, it represents an opportunity to downsize their housing and to move to locations that require less reliance on cars and offer the opportunity for more physical activity which can support long-term health. Shifting gears now, because we've been focusing on housing here, to talk a little bit about mobility. Seniors are 15 times more likely to be killed as pedestrians than as drivers. They represent 1/5 of all road users as pedestrians, and yet 1/2 of all pedestrian deaths. Driving may be the only option when walking and transit use becomes more difficult. I've seen planners any number of times say, oh, let them revert to using a bus. But using transit is very, very challenging, and it needs to be understood what those challenges are in order to make realistic assumptions about what people will do. And furthermore, people are unlikely to start using transit if they haven't been lifelong users of transit. It's important to bear in mind that by 2030, 1/4 of all drivers will be age 65 and above. I believe we're currently at about 1 in 5 drivers. And as I've mentioned before, in terms of the limitations that many of them face in driving, we should all be concerned because there are some dangers on the roads represented by some drivers who should no longer, many of whom should no longer be driving. So transportation planners must comprehend the unique challenges faced by older drivers, including vision constraints, such as cataracts and difficulty with focusing, confusion and disorientation, slower reaction time, difficulty looking over the shoulder, one's shoulder, reactions to medications such as drowsiness, etc. And we need to find creative ways of understanding the range of limitations in movement. So here's an example of some researchers trying to simulate what these constraints would be. I think it's very important to pay attention to details. It's important to pay attention to our individual experiences. We've all had experiences, and if we started talking with people, we'd recognize things that we should be changing in our environment. So, for example, I was walking into a store one day, and I heard my mother was behind me, and I heard a gasp, and I looked, and she had tripped over a 1-inch rise in the curb, and it had been painted to show that there was a rise there, but she was wearing bifocals and sunglasses and didn't see it. She broke her nose in 2 places and ended up with 27 stitches. And it caused me as a planner to go, okay, what about our standards? This was a ramp that was built to code. It was painted to code, and yet it didn't work quite right. So we need to be constantly looking at situations like that and learning from them, and then informing policy through those observations. So we have a range, I mean, and it's not just driving, of course, it's walking. We need to have appropriately sized sidewalks. We need to have appropriately timed stoplights so that people have enough time to get through an intersection, and if not, if it's too long of an intersection, there should be a refuge area for them. We need to recognize the various forms of small motorized vehicles that we may not be used to on our roadways and plan accordingly. We also need to pay attention to the design of our benches. You know, I've mentioned more than once that people have a hard time twisting and turning as they get older. And so the bench on the lower left, we may see more and more of those in our communities because they're more comfortable for people to sit, and they don't have to twist and turn to talk to each other. We need to be providing for shade. The bench in the upper right and the image to the left shows how that setup could accommodate somebody who's in a mobile unit, as is that man in the middle image. We also need to be paying attention to signage. The sign on the right was done to demonstrate the difference in sign sizes so that it would accommodate people with vision constraints. The image on the left, the Ford Freeway, Port Huron, that actually was put up initially that way. The one on the right, the state highway sign, is to show a new typeface and larger size. This was done this way, and the 2 signs left up so that people at this conference could see, have an appreciation of what the differences were in those standards. we need to, you can see in the image on the lower right, it's really hard for people to see that sign, the cross street. And any time that any of us have as planners have difficulty seeing something or comprehending a sign or a wayfinding, etc., if we're having problems and we are not currently constrained with vision problems or anything like that, then we need to translate that as to things that we should pay attention to relative to somebody who's, an older adult. There's a lot of different frameworks for planning for aging. These are a few of the ones that I've listed here. They are, most of them, to be honest, are ones that have been developed and driven by social service organizations as opposed to planners. My experience is that planners have not been taking a lead in this arena, and I really do feel that we should. A recent AARP article indicated there are over 300 aging-focused livable community initiatives throughout the U.S. That's not enough. I mean, it's more than it happened 20 years ago, but there's much more that we need to do. And just connecting all of this back to the overall economics theme of this webinar, I'd like to say the following. Our built environment imposes huge economic costs on the aging process, affecting not only older adults and their caregivers, but society as a whole. In the extent to which we can use our land use and development policies and practice to create more supportive environments, we can reduce housing and transportation costs and create safer environments that facilitate mobility, physical activity, and health, and reduce the risks of injury to our elders and to society as a whole. I am, of course, considering here the risks to all of us of older people who are no longer safe drivers. We collectively have the opportunity to create more livable communities that provide alternatives that enable continued independence as we age and allows for less stressful caregiving. To this end, we must learn to appreciate how older people experience the environment and use this understanding to make changes that enhance our quality of life. The aging of society gives us an unprecedented opportunity to do things differently, to bring people into the planning process. There's lots of resources out there. I wasn't going to try to put a bunch of them on a screen that was only going to be up here for a moment. I do want to direct attention to the AAR Public Policy Institute, that they have generated a number of resources, including a Livable Communities Evaluation Guide, and more recently, the Aging in Place Estate Survey of Livability Policies and Practices. Lots of ideas. These things are available on the web. The National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, Partners for Livable Communities, and MetLife Foundation have a major initiative on livable communities and have developed a blueprint for action. That's also available on the web. And so now we'll turn this back to everybody else for a discussion.
Okay, this is Libby Tyler, and I've been gathering some questions that have come in, and we do have about 20 more minutes that we can take questions and answer them. So what I'd like to do is start with some questions that came in for Professor Mildred Warner's talk that are some clarifications. So two people asked about the survey that was referenced. Was that taken of planners' attitudes, or were those residential attitudes? And not sure, Mildred, if you
Right. That survey.
Okay. Yeah.
That survey was of planners, and it was of planners' attitudes. So yes, there can be a considerable difference between planners' attitudes and residents' attitudes, but we were curious to know what planners thought. And the focus groups actually happened at the 2008 APA meeting in Philadelphia, and I was surprised that the responses of planners were as positive to those attitude statements as they were. And of course, the challenge is moving that conversation then out to the level of the community and getting more community buy-in. But that's where I think webinars like this, education opportunities and examples can actually move us a long way.
Okay. Another question, clarification question for you on the barriers to family-friendly communities. Was transit availability ranked low or perhaps not an option to be selected?
On that particular issue, we had a whole section in the survey on transportation, and it just didn't show up in this slide. I'm sorry, and I should have included that. Most of the communities in our survey were car dependent. Very few had, almost none had any light rail. Those that had any transit had buses. And so the answers to transit questions were related to things like parking requirements and a little bit on buses. So, but the full, we did a PAS memo, a Planning Advisory Service memo on the survey, and that is one that APA has put up on its website for free. And it's actually referenced in the issue brief that we've put up on the website today. So if you want to see more detail on particular questions, you can see it in that brief. And also on my website, we have the raw survey data that's up for people to look at. There were about 100 questions, and so you can see what planners said. But this is planners' view, the professionals' view, not the citizens' view.
And what is your website address again?
It's right up here on the screen, economicdevelopmentandchildcare.org. And if you go there, you'll see a picture on the front that says Planning for Family-Friendly Communities. And click on that. And if you look around on that part of the page, you will see the PAS memo. You'll see the stuff for today's webinar. And you'll also see the survey results on the 2008 APA survey.
Oh, thank you. Okay, and here's a question that I think could be for either of the presenters. Question is, are you starting to see a cultural shift back to appreciation of the benefits of living in multi-generational homes, or are people still strongly resistant to that? Do you want to start with that, Mildred?
I'll start first and then turn it over to Deborah. What's really interesting is it could very well be the case that the move to not being in multi-generational households was an aberration of post-World War II up to the end of the century. Because before that time, the notion of living in multi-generational settings was actually pretty common in most societies and most cultures, and it sort of waned in the U.S. in that post-war period. What we're seeing now is with the large increases, particularly in Latino and Asian households, the cultural preference for living in, maintaining multi-generational households is much stronger among those population groups. And that's actually a very good thing because we've got a lot of big houses that need more people to fill them up now that family sizes are smaller. And with the boomerangs of today, with the economy being bad, you're seeing a lot of children, young adults, boomeranging back into their family households. So I think we may begin to see more multi-generational households going forward. And there was actually a project, and we highlighted this in a multi-generational planning brief that we did 2 years back, and it was looking at how could we retool these large suburban homes to become more satisfactory for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. Well, 2, 3, 4, 5 is what the project was called, generations all living in one roof. And so I think that the potential of that is actually pretty high. But I'd be interested in Deborah's opinions.
Well, I think it's mixed. I think the economy is driving it, and in many cases people are being forced into the multi-generational situation because they don't have the choice. They don't have the money to put their elders in the assisted living, for example, and the young people are moving back in because they don't have options. My observation, having my students at Portland State University were working with a Chinese community at one point, and the elders were decrying the fact that their children did not want them to live with them. And so we were hearing from elders that their children didn't want them. We were also hearing from elders that they didn't necessarily want to live with the children. And and I've seen that as well in terms of the phenomena in China and other Asian countries. You've got a lot of seniors who are wanting for various reasons to live alone, some by choice and some not. And in some cases it's a rejection of the children, and in other cases it's something that they want to do on their own. So I do think it's mixed. I think that I think Mildred's absolutely right. The ethnic groups, there's many that are bringing that culture, and that may create a model that people will see and they'll really like and say that this could work. But I think we've created major problems in our zoning in terms of making it feasible. So I live in a township that has older houses, and it has carriage houses that many of them are grandfathered in with apartments in the carriage houses, but they're not legal. And so this is a place that has plenty of room for these kinds of accessory apartments in the large old houses, and the zoning code does not allow for that to happen. And I frankly think that if I ever got to the situation where we would consider having my mother live with us, I'm not sure she'd want to, because I've got young kids. And so I think we're getting some models which are exciting in terms of seeing these intergenerational households that are healthy and that they're working well. But we have to look at what kind of constraints we've created in terms of our zoning code and regulations that discourage that. The other reality is that you've got families that have spread all around the U.S. And when you have young people going to find their way in another part of the country and families split and whatnot, it creates a problem in terms of them re-merging as an intergenerational household.
Another question, and I think this might be more for Professor Howe. It says, how can these ideas be applied to rural or semi-rural environments? Is it feasible for elders to expect to continue to live in these environments?
It's a challenge in the extent, it becomes a challenge both in rural and suburban communities when we begin to lose our grocery stores and the other support services that we need for daily living. I certainly can think of any number of rural communities that, particularly the older boroughs, that are relatively walkable and more dense and have more housing alternatives where it is feasible for somebody to age in place, as long as they can find a way of accessing the food and medicine and things like that that they need. I have given some ideas and suggestions for dealing with the actual house itself. And one can make the house very supportive of aging in place, but you still have the issue of access to services. And so you have to look at both. And you might be able to make the house more accessible, but you're going to have to put an array of services that will provide this support. And it may well be that and we didn't talk about this. I mean, this topic is so large and we only have a limited time. But there's a range of services that are being developed around the country that are trying to connect people and provide supportive environments. And it's not happening, it's not just in urban areas. There are some initiatives that are happening elsewhere that are trying to deal with older people in the rural communities. But it becomes a service thing, and that's often out of the purview of planners. And so, the question here is whether or not the planners should try to connect with service agencies and try to do this more comprehensive planning to address the needs of older people in these communities.
Okay, thank you.
Another question. Can I mention on this rural issue? This is where schools become absolutely fundamentally important, because in rural communities often the only public institution is the school. And rural communities, many rural communities are losing their young, and so they actually have empty classrooms available. So you can imagine, think of your school as a place where you could have a congregate meal site and run the cafeteria for a second shift. Think of the school as a place that could offer elder daycare as well as child daycare in an empty classroom. And think of the ancillary benefits of that in terms of senior citizens helping to read to children, etc. It's also possible to use the school bus as a public transit system and to do a second run to pick up elders, or to pick up elders along with the children. And if you had more adults on the bus, maybe you'd have less behavior issues. So for service access in rural areas, I think linking with the schools becomes absolutely critical. It's also important in terms of planning. The USDA supports elder housing developments, and it's important to think about where those are located. Are they located in the little village center, so you'd be more accessible to services, or are they located out in a green field? And too much of our elder housing has been focused in green fields, and that creates greater accessibility problems.
Another question is about transit. How can transit in suburbs be improved for the aging population? This is a related question.
So again, I would just say on that, this idea of linked transit. Right now we have paratransit for elders, paratransit for disabled children, paratransit for disabled adults. We have Medicaid transit to help people get to doctor's offices. You could link all of those together to create a transit system, even in communities that don't currently have one. And if you were able to link with the school, every community that doesn't have a public transit system has a school transit system. And if you could think about coming together, I think you could begin to address your needs. But it would require, moving across all these silos of schools and Department of Social Services and Department of Aging and Department of Health, and probably in communities that don't even have a Department of Transit. So it definitely needs a planner to help think about how you bring that together. But it is possible, and I know of communities that have done it.
And again, it's important to look at how individuals experience all of this. So I've heard of instances in which elders have gone to use a paratransit system, but the paratransit system wouldn't allow their grandchildren to travel on this little tiny vehicle. And they need that assistance of this, like a 10, 12, 13-year-old to help them carry their groceries. So that policy framework would preclude them to be able to effectively use this. That's one consideration. And you won't find out that unless you talk with people who are using it and find out what their constraints are. Another typical constraint is a lot of people have incontinence problems, and so they can't sit in a vehicle for a very long time. So how do you deal with that? Well, one of them is to make sure that there's easily accessible public restrooms at various stops. If somebody has to get out and use it, allow them to get out and use it. And if you start, addressing those kinds of nitty-gritty considerations, people might be able to use the system that previously they could not.
Thank you. A question for Mildred Warner. How can government enable private development to satisfy these needs without using taxpayers' money? How can government... Yeah.
I got you. So one of the things is mixed-use zoning, to allow some of this stuff to happen. And the second is incentives. And these incentives can be positive and they can be negative. I'm thinking of California when it was experiencing its huge development pressure. Whole neighborhoods were getting built out without a single child care facility. And the price of land was such that which doesn't make high returns, couldn't really afford to buy land and establish child care centers. So a number of cities in California put impact fees on new development for child care. So they made sure that there was a facility built in the neighborhood at the same time the neighborhood was built out to provide for child care. And what happens is, and what the research shows, is that when you build a full-service community that has all these services at the beginning, it's actually easier to sell the houses because that's the kind of community that people want to live in. So as our population ages and more of us want to age in place, we're going to be looking for communities that offer these full-service benefits. And developers pay attention to market trends. So I think, one, cities need to enable with their zoning codes, and number two, when developers aren't sufficiently forward-looking, cities need to force them through things like impact fees.
Thank you. A question for Deborah Howe. How do you feel about zoning for home occupation child care, and why not the same type of care for seniors?
I actually think, Mildred, you're the one that should handle that.
Okay.
Haven't you worked on that?
Yes. So in New York State about 20 years ago, we made child care in a person's home exempt from any zoning rules statewide. In California, over the last decade and a half, they've been going community by community, making home-based child care exempt from zoning regulations. The sad news is that neighbors often think that child care is a NIMBY issue because it creates more traffic and more noise, because when children play outside, they shout and scream, these joyful little shouts, and some people don't like to hear joy. It's really kind of sad. But for elder care, I'm sure you would have similar issues of particularly the drop-off and the pickup, because it's rather slow. A person is slow getting out of the car. They're slow getting into the place. But I think we're actually probably going to see a lot of family-based elder care, where just like people today care for children in their home, under 10 or under 5 children, they'll probably be doing that for elders, because if your elder parent is living with you, when you're off at work, somebody needs to be watching them, particularly if they're sort of memory care. And it does make sense to congregate them in small groups where one provider can take care of several at a time. Plus, there's the socialization value that people need to be interacting with other people. It improves their health and prolongs their life.
Thank you. Another question on development. It seems the construction of retirement communities are counterproductive to promoting aging in place. Have any large retirement community builders embraced any of the concepts which were spoken about today to make the living environment more dynamic for more than just retirees?
I actually had heard over the years anecdotes of retirement communities in Arizona where they very specifically did not build sidewalks and make other provisions for aging because they wanted to attract the young old, and they didn't want people to come driving into the community and seeing frail elderly walking around with walkers. In other words, they wanted them to leave by the time their needs changed. So, yeah, I mean, there are those kinds of examples, and you could give an example to prove everything. But there are retirement communities in Maryland that are being designed with universal design principles. A lot of the retirement communities are out in the suburbs, and a lot of them are dependent on cars, and so they're not designed, you know, with the higher density and the range of housing alternatives. But some of them are moving in the directions of certainly providing the sidewalks and designing the internal design on the houses that are more supportive. Do you have more, Mildred?
Yes, I had a student last year who did a thesis looking at retirement communities that were changing their charters to allow families with young children in them because they were having trouble filling up with just retirees. And one of the features that was attractive to families with young children is the fact that there was a cafeteria on site, recreation facilities on site, green space, and some of them were doing co-located elder care and child care. And it's just the beginnings of a movement. But I can remember myself, my mother-in-law was in one of those retirement communities that went from independent apartments all the way up. And I remember visiting when my children were little and saying, man, I would kill for a place where you could go downstairs for dinner and there was a van going to the mall. You know, as a young mother with little kids, and this would be really nice, but recognizing that you also don't want the little kids tripping somebody and causing them to fall and break their hip. But are there ways that you can think of some of the design features in these communities, even the ones in greenfields, do actually provide some living support services that would also be highly attractive to families with young children?
And
there was a senior housing project in Portland, Oregon that had a child care center right in the heart of it, which was a nice touch.
Okay, here's another specific question. Which communities have used school transportation systems to transport older adults? Do either of you know of any?
I don't. Do you, Mildred?
This is one where in New York State we passed a law about 20 years ago making this possible. And of course there's a long distance between possible and willingness to move on it. The better example I have is from Norwich, New York, which is a sort of northern part of Appalachia community without a lot of money, and they took their paratransit for elders for pre-K, they took their Meals on Wheels transit and their Medicaid transit, and they put them all together, and with their community action program, they created the beginnings of the core of a fixed route transportation system that anybody could ride. But they used all those various sources of funding to help make the core happen. And then they also had a dial-a-ride program as part of it. Getting the schools to participate, you're more likely to see schools that use the public transit for children, and many cities do, as opposed to rural schools that allow their transit to become transit for the public. So it's sort of like this is one that only goes one direction. Schools use public transit, but very few schools have opened themselves to being available for other people's transit. But I think that's where we're going to be moving in the future.
Okay. And we had a related question on the liability issues that might have been raised with that as well. We've got a comment here that it seems to the commenter that aging in place is possible when seniors are with it, in quotes. However, how realistic is it to say aging in place when seniors require constant assistance or continuous nursing. Anyone have a comment on that?
Mildred, you want to try it?
Sure. I mean, this is the point. You need a variety of services for a variety of needs. And the longer, if you can keep a senior in their own home for an extra year, you've saved, what, $30, $40, $50,000? So, but there are times when people do need to be in more concentrated settings. And I remember a presentation by I think it's called United Hebrew Communities or something. It's elder care in Boston. And the director was saying, you know, we can get economies of scale if we can have people who need care all located in the same building, because then the visiting nurse just goes from apartment to apartment. She doesn't have to get in her car and drive from house to house. And we can actually put commercial services in the ground floor so that if people want to go to shop, they can just take the elevator and go downstairs. So the notion of you know, age-focused housing does make sense, but setting it in the context of the city and the other needs and recognizing that there's a whole range of needs across the life cycle, and you don't want to jump to the age-segregated notion too quick if you could actually do other alternatives that actually may be a little cheaper and keep people independent and integrated with the community a little longer.
What Mildred is describing is a naturally occurring retirement community, or NORC. And a NORC can be an array of services that are provided to a cluster of older people that might be in a large apartment complex, but you can also apply a NORC in a neighborhood. And there's some wonderful models that are emerging there. And essentially, this would involve people who are living in their house, and they would be regularly checked by professionals and volunteers and other caregivers. And there's a system in place to catch people when they're having problems. But otherwise, you know, for the most part, ensuring that they can continue their independence and thereby stay out of the medical facilities.
Okay, we're about out of time, and there were some questions we didn't get to, so I do apologize. Also wanted to note that the PowerPoints are up on the website, which is utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. So Utah APA in the archive. And Brittany, did you have final instructions?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Libby, for moderating today's event, and for Mildred and Deborah for their presentations. And for those of you attendees who are still with us, I'm going to go through a few reminders just about submitting your CM credits for attending today's event, so just stick with us for a minute or so. Thank you, guys. Okay, well, for those of you who are still with us, I want to go through a few reminders. First off, to log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to www.planning.org/CM. Select today's date, which is Friday, March 9th, and then select today's webcast, which is the economic impacts and opportunities of families, children, elders, and caregivers. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credits. We are also recording today's session, and you will be able to find a recording of this webcast along with a PDF of the PowerPoints at www.utah-apa.org/webcast-archive. And this does conclude today's session, and I want to thank everyone again for attending.
Thanks, Brittany.